Hi everyone, and thank you for coming to this presentation, The Golden Age of Topography in Architecture, which examines the close relationship that existed between topography and architecture in the US during the middle of the 20th century. I will now share my screen so you can see the slides. And set it to full screen. Great. Almost from the beginning, architecture and topography have always been connected. The ancient Egyptians, for instance, covered their buildings with hieroglyphs that told the deeds of the gods and the pharaohs. It was usually a way for the person who was responsible for building the temple or other public buildings to boast about that fact. You see here the Parthenon in Rome, and you'll notice that in both the picture before, one of the Egyptian temple, and this one, that though the topography was part of the building, it could be considered to be serving more of a decorative function than anything else. And this was the norm for centuries, from a niche in a mosque, which had verses from the Quran, to an inscription memorializing an event, or even when used in the text to provide context as signage, the topography was always something that was added to the building and not an essential part of it. And it was this way until the middle of the 20th century. In the 1940s, World War II had just ended, and in the US, there was a huge housing boom. This was fueled by the need for new homes for the returning soldiers. In California, most of these buildings were being built in a style that embodied the hope, optimism, and prosperity that existed at that time. This was a new, modern style that was based on the Bauhaus style which began in Germany. This was a new golden age of capitalism, relatively stable peace, and an absence of any notable financial crises. This was also the time of the rise of the American automobile. As car ownership increased, the automobile became a household staple. And it happened at the same time that the middle class sprawled into those freshly built suburban homes. Travel was not only possible, it was a benchmark of financial success. A new kind of eatery popped up. Around the country, drive-in and roadside stands appeared to cater to this newly mobile public, a public with lots of disposable income to spend. The question confronting these restaurant operators was, what would catch the eye of those fast-moving motorists? It became clear that the more startling, the better. This would require owners and architects to develop a visual imagery so customers would recognize it from far away as they sped down the road. Ever since the invention of cars, buildings had been used to catch the attention of motorists. But it was now in the 1950s that it became more widespread. And it was in Los Angeles that a new style called boogie appeared. It was named after a coffee shop called Boogie's, which was built in Los Angeles in 1949. Some characteristics of the style were a huge cantilevered roofs and futuristic shapes. In fact, the style is sometimes called space age. It was influenced by the desires of the public in this age of rocket ships and nuclear energy. Anything futuristic was popular. Like this house of the future in Disneyland. Still waiting for this one. It would be amazing to live in. The style soon became a national phenomenon. From the Space Needle in Seattle to a church in Florida, the boogie style was catching on. And one of its masterpieces is this one, the TWA terminal built at the JFK airport in New York. The style even spread internationally. And this building was built in Belgium for a World's Fair. Another factor that came into play at this time was the fact that there weren't any size restrictions on signs, and huge signs became all the rage. And those signs grew bigger and bigger and even bigger. In fact, the signage became even more important than the building itself. As we can see here, the motel cabins themselves seem pretty boring, but the sign is what stands out. It was not surprising then to have like amazing signage standing next to a more or less nondescript building. And of course, an important part of that signage was its topography. Back then, architects would hand draw signs, and these included the type. Even if they started with a known typeface, they would make their own adjustments depending on what they were using it for. So quite often, all the letters would be exactly like, not all the letters would be exactly like the original typeface. This was also a style known for its playfulness. So one of the other things that you find a lot is that in keeping with this, you really saw a regular baseline being used. They were also masters of using hierarchy, with huge type that was readable from far away, whilst the motorist was in the distance. And the smaller type used for when the motorist was much closer, for example, things like vacancy, etc. Here's another good example of a sign without a regular baseline. It's not as extreme, but you can also see a part of another sign right across the street, a part of a motel on the other side of the street. And this sign looks so much, this one that we're looking at, Al's Chickenette, looks so much more engaging than the actual building that it stands in front of. Here's an amazing drive-in sign from that time. I'm sure they're doing really well right now with all of the lockdown procedures going on. That seems to be the only way to go and see movies anymore. The signs started to feel like an integral part of the architecture, like this one that would carry the theme of the building into its design. Or as in this one, where the sign is like an actual wall of the building itself. This is Bob's Big Boy. It's even painted in the same color as the main building, and it's the same material. In fact, something that started happening was where a whole wall of the building would be made extra large to serve as a sort of billboard. This was something that had never been done before. In the case of the one that we're looking at, though, the sign is still separate from the main building. But you can see how it was just a lot of blank space on which to display interest in topography. So it's not surprising then that if you're going down the street today, the most interesting signs are from the 50s and 60s. Here we're looking at the Las Vegas sign, which many people are familiar with. It uses so many different typefaces that you'd expect it to be a jumbled mess, but the shapes are used skillfully to make it work. Then taking ideas from modernism, where form followed function, Googie buildings took on an additional role, which was the function was advertising. The buildings were becoming more like the signs next to them, not like the boring buildings that we saw before, the motel, uh, next to a dramatic sign. They weren't just buildings anymore. The whole building became just one large working billboard, like this car wash. The interesting thing you can also see in the picture is a present day sign for Jack in the Box. It's right over the stop one part of the car wash. Easy to miss. And you can see how much smaller it was in comparison to the car wash letters. And granted that it's in the distance, but it's not that far. In fact, one of the letters is probably about as big as the Jack in the Box sign. The architecture itself was designed to hold these letters. If you took them away, there would be a certain emptiness in the design. Architects started wanting to make the signs not only bigger, but also an actual part of the architecture. Again, here, you can see how much a part of the architecture the topography is. If this building had new owners who no longer needed a sign and took it down, it would look empty. Now, I'm not sure if this building is still around, which would be a shame, but you can see how the sign was starting to become part of the building. It's pretty much just sticking right out of the building. And I think that you can figure out here that the ships that it's referring to are probably rocket ships. This was basically the design that became popular. A horizontally oriented building. Most buildings back then were pretty much one-story buildings with a pylon or huge vertical wall like the sign of the Bob's Big Boy that we saw earlier, which would carry the signage. There we see that in the restaurant called Pans. Here, sorry. You can see that the restaurant itself is down at the bottom with all of the glass, and the pylon that's coming out of it is what holding the sign Pans. And even on the sign's background, it echoes the roof line, which is sort of a zigzagged roof, which we can get a better view of in this other picture. Here, you can see the zigzag of the roof, which is echoed in this sign. Here's another example called Norms. You can see the shape of the roof again echoed in the sign. And if there were another owner, unless they had a 5-letter business name, then they would probably have to get rid of the sign. The architecture, the sign, and its topography that's on the sign, they were all tied together. An even more striking example is this restaurant called Chips. The 3 pylons rise out of the building and support a huge sign, which is composed entirely of the word chips. The actual font was probably designed by the architects who designed the building themselves, but we do know for sure that the building was designed first, and then the lettering that they came up with was used by the restaurant for its menus, etc. Just like the Chips building, the restaurant before, you'll find out a lot of these buildings that the topography is such an integral part of it that if you were to remove it, the design will suffer. For instance, in this case, where the word Hausa covers about half of the building. If you remove this, the front facade of this building would be just that much more boring. And Even this one, which is not as integrated as some of the others that we've seen, this amazing topography is such a great addition to this building. Just imagine how much more nondescript and again boring of a design this would be if it were not there. Here's another one that's really integrated into the architecture. You're not going to just have those blank shapes at the top, and they were built in the way they were to hold that number of letters. And they had to hold that word Tucson. Even if you remove the in part of it, that would leave a hole in the design. So why did it all stop? I mean, we still drive around in cars. In fact, even more people have cars today than back then. Well, like most trends, the Googie style fell out of fashion, which is not to say that other styles couldn't have come along and be just as good. One other thing was that before architects would learn topography and how to write clearly in what was called architectural lettering. Now that is rarely taught, because what came around was the advent of digital type. What you're seeing here is DigiCortez, which is the first digital type. And this definitely played a part. So this is now rarely taught because they don't need to. They can just download a font. But perhaps a major reason for the disappearance of this union of topography and architecture was that these huge signs proliferated, and soon the main streets of most American cities looked a lot like the Las Vegas Strip. And in response to what they saw as this urban blight, many cities imposed size restrictions. For example, there probably won't be another motel with a sign like the one that we saw on that Caribbean motel. That's because there's probably a size restriction ordinance in that city, and that would stop anything like that from happening. And that ban on the size of signs was the beginning of the end, as it all slowly faded away. Thank you very much for coming to listen to my presentation. Thank you.